Hello everyone, thank you for making some time to watch this video presentation. If you are watching this video, I assume either you are interested in finding out how first-year teachers felt like when they had to teach in 2020, or probably you are just like me. You are a first-year teacher starting your teaching journey at the beginning of pandemic. Or maybe you are now a first-year teacher going to start your teaching journey real soon. If one of my assumptions is correct, then I hope by watching this video, you will find some encouragement to reflect on your teaching practice and also to gain some practical ideas for your class. Today, I will start by sharing my background first, and I will share how I do reflective practice throughout my first year teaching. And finally, I will share with you what changes I made during my first year and second year teaching. Without further ado, let's start. I was just thinking where should I start sharing my background from, and I think it's best if I start sharing some of my experience before I came to Japan. I studied English education back in Indonesia for my undergraduate, and throughout my undergraduate study, I involved in some community service programs where we taught English to children from different backgrounds. After graduating, I started working in a language school for adults. My students at that time, they varied from 14 or 15 years old to 60, 65 years old. And finally, after working for 2 years, I decided I wanted to continue my education. And I knew at that time I wanted to take TESOL for my master's degree. So after a long consideration, I considered Japan and I chose Soka University. During my master's study, I worked in our self-access center as a student staff. I worked for several different programs. I worked for Chit Chat Club and also for speaking centers, where we help students who want to take TOEFL IBT or IELTS tests. We help especially for the speaking part. Other than that, I also worked as a teaching assistant for 1 year. And finally, during my last semester in grad school, I had a 15-week teaching practicum where we taught English classes for undergraduate students, and most of them are beginner students. After completing my master's degree, I was confident with my teaching skills, and although I know I had very limited experience in a real classroom situation, I, I, I thought I had enough interactions with students, so I was confident and I thought I was ready to start my teaching journey, and I also knew that I wanted to teach at the university level. Now, with my experience, I developed some expectations how my classes should be. I had this expectation I wanted my students to be active. And I also developed some standard for myself what kind of teachers I wanted to be. Little did I know back then that some previous studies have shown teachers who have just started their teaching career often feel frustrated and overwhelmed as they experience reality shock. I'm not sure, and I didn't know why this thought had never occurred to me before. Maybe it was the confidence, maybe it was the excitement to start teaching. So, yes, this thought, I had never thought about this before. But now, yes, I am aware about this. There is always a difference between experience as a student teacher and experience during the first year of professional teaching. When novice teachers have expectations, standard, but they face reality shock, they often feel burnt out. And without the right strategy to cope with this situation, They eventually give up teaching after a few years. The situation described in the previous study also applied to me, and I think it was even worse because in 2020, we all experienced a whole different teaching situation. We transitioned from face-to-face classes to online classes, a situation we had never experienced before, and I could say that my education definitely didn't prepare me for this situation. So throughout my first year teaching, there were many big questions in my head. Mainly, the main question is, am I doing this right? Because during my first year teaching, I felt exhausted and I couldn't enjoy teaching. So I thought I must have done something wrong. One day, I was just sitting down and I reflected back on my graduate school experience. I somehow remember all the discussions we had in the class. We talk about how there is no one best way to teach students. Teaching is not about what's right or what is wrong. Teaching is about finding what works for us as teachers and finding what works for our students. From there, I gained back the motivation that I needed, and I learned the importance of reflective practice to develop myself as a teacher. Reflective practice can be described as a reflection of a teacher's daily practices in the classroom, including challenges and successes in order to make conscious decisions for the improvement of future practices. Or to put it simply, reflective practice is a personal tool for teachers to assess themselves. There are many benefits of reflective practice, but the one I want to highlight in this presentation is reflective practice allows teachers to realize the influence of their beliefs on their decision making. There are some activities suggested for teachers who want to do reflective practice. For example, making a teaching journal, having a critical friend, teacher development groups, class observations, or action research. These activities can be done individually, with a peer, or as a group. Based on my own experience, when teachers are suggested to do reflective practice, we have two main issues. The first one, we have very little time to do reflection. If we have some extra time, all we want to do is preparing for the next lesson, or we want to do grading, or we just want to give feedback to our students, right? And the second main issue, we feel anxious because it is uncomfortable to see what doesn't work in our classes. It is uncomfortable to admit that sometimes we don't perform as well as our expectation. So from this experience, I learned that in order for teachers to do reflective practice, it takes willingness and it also takes courage. That's why right now what I'm comfortable with is to do individual reflection. Individual reflection works well for me because it doesn't require a specific schedule for me to sit with other teachers, but I can do it within my own time. After I started doing reflective practice, I no longer ask myself this question, am I doing this right? No, because I realized it's so much bigger than what is right and what is wrong. But I changed the questions for my reflection. I pondered over these three questions. First one, who am I as a teacher? And when I found the answer, it helped me whenever I have to make decisions in my class. The second question, how my students feel if I do certain things. Oftentimes as teacher, we forget how students feel. but I want to take my students' feeling as a consideration. This doesn't mean that I indulge my students, but it means that I am trying to find a balance between giving them the challenges that they need, but avoiding unnecessary stress. And the third question I always ask myself, what can I do better next? When I thought about what can I do better next, I consider what works in my class and what doesn't work. And I keep reminding myself, you can be critical with your teaching practice, you can be critical with yourself as a teacher, but don't do it in a destructive way. So I want to be critical to myself in a positive way. According to the literature review, there are three components of reflective practice. First one is experience, and then reflective processes, and the last one is informations. So based on my experience as a first-year teacher, I did some reflections by myself and I made some changes for my second year. The changes that I made and I want to share during this presentation is related to giving feedback, using technology, the use of target language in my classroom, and learner autonomy, the last one. So let's start with the first one. It's about giving feedback. First, let me tell you that my decision about giving feedback during my first year was based on my experience as a student. I was always happy when I got personal feedback from my teachers. So that was what I tried to do. I tried to give personal feedback for all assignments to every single student. And imagine that in my class, I use Google Class for online classes, and we always have extensive listening, quick writes, vocabulary project, reflection journals, two paragraph writings in one semester, also two presentations. And when I try to give personal feedback for everything and everyone, as a result, I didn't have time for anything else. The rest of the time, I used it to plan the next lessons. So I didn't have time to do research. I didn't have time to think of publications, and that is still my biggest regret up until today. I spent so much time on giving feedback and planning the next lesson. So I knew at that time, after my first year, this is something I have to change. That's what I told myself. Uh, I tried to imagine that what would my students feel when they got email notifications and the emails were all in English. So when we use Google Class and then we put the comment to give feedback, students would get the email notifications, right? And that's what I try to imagine. I try to see from my point of view as a Japanese learner. Whenever I get emails in Japanese, either I will ignore the email or I will read it after some time when I have some free time and I have time to translate the email. I assume that if the email is important and if it's for me, the email should come in English or at least it should have the translation. So again, I ask myself, is it possible that my students feel the same thing? When they get the notifications in English, they will just ignore. So yes, I realize there is that possibility. That's why they keep making the same mistakes again, let's say, or they keep repeating what I have told them not to. That's probably because they don't read those personal feedback. So I changed several things during my second year. I tried to give first general feedback, for example, for paragraph writing or for extensive listening, for quick writes activity. I try to give general feedback for my students. I usually give the feedback in the class. I show them the common mistakes, so they know that they should pay attention to those aspects that I mentioned in the class. And I try to give group feedback. For example, we have a group presentation. So instead of giving personal feedback for each member of the group, I just give group feedback. And I give personal feedback specifically for a weekly reflection journal. So that's how I keep my communications with my students, uh, personal feedback for weekly reflections. After I made these changes, I feel that during my second year, teaching is more enjoyable and I have more time to prepare for the lessons, and I finally have time to think of my publications, and it is just a much better year this second year after I made these changes. The second point is about using technology. During my first year, I tried to use different online applications. I used Kahoot, Quizlet, Flipgrid, you name it. I think I used many things and I cannot even remember what else. And of course, I used Google Class, I used Zoom. And it's just that whenever I heard stories from other teachers that they use uh, different online technologies and it worked really well for their class, I just felt that, oh my God, I need to do the same. Oh my God, I need to try that one as well. So, yes, during my first year, I use different online application, different technology. And after, at the end of my first year, I asked my students, how do you feel about online class? And many of them mentioned, I'm not good with technology. I cannot enjoy online class. Fortunately, they said that it's not only about English class, but also for other classes. And that's when I realized, this is how my students feel. They need guidance how to use technology. I cannot just assume that because they are young, they should be able to tackle technology issues. They should be able to navigate this new application. They need guidance which button they should click, which page they should go, and where they should go from that page to another page. They need that kind of guidance. And that's when I know that, okay, if we are gonna do another online semester during my second year, what am I gonna do? So I asked myself, what do you want to get from this online class? What should be the focus of your class? And I always know that in my class, I want to focus on speaking skills. That's my belief. So when it comes to technology, I try to keep it super simple. During my second year, I just use Zoom, Kahoot, and Google Class. I try to focus on group interactions, students interaction. I try to focus on more speaking activities, and I try to build routines that students can follow. And after I made these changes, I can see that my second year students, they enjoy online class so much more. And at the end of last semester, when I read their uh, final weekly reflections, they mentioned that at the beginning they were afraid of online class, they had difficulties, but apparently it was not as scary as they thought it would be because I provided guidance and uh, not only because I provided guidance and uh, they didn't feel that overwhelmed with many online applications. So that's when I know I did something right. Finally. The third point is about the use of target language. Uh, this is not related to any classroom activities, but this is more related to my belief as a teacher. During my first year, I consider myself pretty strict when it comes to using English. We had this English only English only rule in my class. Maybe that decision came from my experience working in a language school. So when I was working in the language school, uh, even when we were dealing with beginner students, we were not allowed to speak in our first language. So if my students came to me and asked me, for example, the meaning of a word that they didn't understand, I would find different ways to explain the meaning. If I wanted my students to do something and I could see they didn't understand, I would find different ways to make sure that they knew what to do. So I thought that this is the same beginners. This is the same beginner students, right? The one in my home country and then the ones in Japan. So I thought if I could deal with this in my home country and if this method worked pretty well with my students back then, why it wouldn't work here in Japan? So let me give it a try. So that's what I decided during my first year. Okay, English only. But then I think I just had this assumption. Again, I had so many assumptions during my first year. Assumptions, expectations, um, that my students would just follow the rule. So whenever I heard my students in the middle of group discussions or in the middle of the class speaking in Japanese and not in English, I would feel disappointed. But I knew I had to remind them. So I told my students, hey, remember, we have this English only rule. Alright, because we are in English class, so let's speak only in English. I reminded them. But then I couldn't control every single student, so I would just hear my students here and there speaking Japanese, and I couldn't stop myself from feeling disappointed. So when I was preparing for my second year, I asked myself, what can I do so my students want to speak in English and they listen when I remind them, hey, this is English class, let's speak in English. The answer actually came to me when I was reading a book and there was this statement in the book. The more you control something, the more it tries to slip away. So I was like, aha, okay. This could be the reason why my students last year didn't listen to me. I tried to control them so much with my English only policy. So during my second year, why not showing some flexibility? That's what I am trying now in my class. I try to give my students more time to speak in Japanese. Still limited, but definitely more than during my first year. For example, this time, if they want to check their understanding about my instruction or about the assignments, they could check their understanding by talking in Japanese with their friends. If there are words that they don't understand, I teach them how to ask in English, but their friends can answer in Japanese. Or what else? Oh, another example. Uh, when I assign them to give peer feedback on paragraph writing, yes, they can also speak in Japanese because it's much more efficient. By showing this flexibility, I let go of some control and I know that it is working really well now in my class. My students actually listen when I remind them, hey, speak less Japanese, more English. They will listen to me and they will just switch. Okay, English. They will start saying their opinions in English. The second thing is I try to show some interest in speaking Japanese. Not that I can form coherent sentences in Japanese yet, but one or two words sometimes, one or two times, sometimes in the class, I throw Japanese words to my students. So for example, if I want to make sure that they are okay during the explanation, I would ask, uh, okay everyone, up until here, daijoubu? They will laugh actually. But that kind of interest and that kind of reaction from students actually develop my relationship between me as a teacher and my students. They know that I am learning Japanese the same way that they are learning English. So with this good relationship, they actually listen when I tell them, okay, English time. Stop speaking in Japanese, let's back to English time. They would switch, they would speak in English, they listen to me. So I think this is definitely the belief that has changed from my first year to my second year. I want to have this flexibility in my class because I can see the positive reactions from students, and of course it brings positive changes to my whole classroom atmosphere. So I'm not as strict as I used to in my first year. Now, the last point I'm going to share with you today is about learner autonomy. I see learner autonomy as students having capacity to be responsible of their learning. And I know that teachers can contribute to developing learner autonomy by giving students options in the class, for example. So before I started my first year, that's what I had in mind. Okay, I wanted to give my students options about this, A or B. I wanted to listen to them. I wanted to develop their autonomy so they know that learning is their responsibility. This is their class. That's what I wanted to do before I started my first year. But then when we started with online class, I think I was overwhelmed with the situation. So my goal during my first year was to keep everyone on the same page. As a result, my class became more teacher-centered. And my first year was frustrating because I couldn't do what I believe about learner autonomy. I couldn't do what I expected myself to do. So I was disappointed, yes. So again, during my reflection, I asked, okay, who are you as a teacher? You want your students to develop learner autonomy. If we are going to do another online class, another online semester, what can you do? I asked myself that question. Somehow, after I asked myself that question, I realized I should be asking myself, are you willing to try something new in your class? Are you willing to try to implement your belief in the class? And that was like the affirmation that I needed. So I know the answer right away. I was like, okay, I'm willing to take the risk. Whatever happens, I will try my best to give my students options in the class so I can develop their autonomy. So that's what I've been trying to do. I give my students options. For example, when we did Unit 2, I ask my students, hey, we are now in Unit 2. Do you want to do reading or do you want to do the listening activity? When we do group discussion in the class, I ask them, which topic do you want? Or I tell them, okay, this week is free topic. You can choose the topic by yourself. And I feel that this year I am more student-centered. And when we go back to the rate between 1 to 10, this year I would rate myself 6 or 7, which it makes me happier as a teacher because I can implement my belief. And I also see my students being engaged in the learning process because by giving these options to my students, I allow them to learn what they are interested in. So they become more engaged, my students are happier, my class become more active, and I'm very satisfied with my class this year. Finally, from the sharing, you can see that after I did the reflection, I made some changes, and those changes led to a much better academic year. I am happy with my second year now. But just because I am happy doesn't mean that I will stop the reflection. It actually encourages me to keep reflecting on my teaching practice. And as I get more experience, I know that my practice or my belief will definitely change. So it's important to sustain the reflective practice. Because after all, teaching is a lifelong learning process. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time.